Jerry Thomas, actual name is Gerald Thomas. I was born in New Zion in Clarendon County, which is just west of here. 5th grade through retirement, I was in Charlotte, North Carolina, retired to Pawleys Island. Lived in Virginia for a little while when I was at Fort Eustis, and was in Vietnam for 10 and a half months before I was discharged. Now, that's basically it. I was drafted in I got my draft notice in 1966 for the U.S. Army. Surprisingly, I reported for induction on Friday, January the 13th, 1967, which I thought was kind of unique. I was hoping it wasn't indicative of anything that was going to be coming, and apparently it wasn't. It turned out, I'm careful about what I talk about my military service because I had a relatively good tour of service in the military. I spent my 2 years in the military, did not pull KP a time, pulled guard duty once in Vung Tau. Spent my, I never did find out what it was, but when I got out of the basic training and I went to Fort Eustis, Virginia, supposedly for AIT training, AIT, which is Advanced Infantry Training, as an Army seaman. And I was curious as to what that was. And I got there, and then they diverted me from the Army seaman thing to being permanent party cadre is what they called it. So I stayed on post at Fort Eustis, Virginia, and I stayed there as a supply and as a company armorer for the Student Officers Company. And left there and went to Vietnam, and I was supposed to, okay, I'll keep going. I was supposed to, when I left Seattle, Tacoma, and we landed at Cameron Bay, and I was supposed to be heading to the 1st Cav Air Mobile as a company armorer. And that slot was filled, so they sent me to Benoit Replacement Center. I stayed there for a day and a half. They found me a position in Vung Tau, Vietnam, which is, I found out later, an in-country R&R center. And I went down there as supply clerk, and I forgot to mention earlier, I was deferred 3 times because I was doing some defense work. And I got draft notices early, and I was doing work for General Dynamics, Electric Boat Division. So I was like 26 when I got drafted, which was about as late. They were going to get me then, because I think 27 was a cutoff. But I was older, so I got down there, and they needed a replacement for a club manager. There was a club called the Red Dog Saloon at the 2nd Maintenance Battalion. And being 26, and I'd finished top graduate in leadership school at Fort Eustis, the commander decided I'd make a good replacement. So I spent my tour in Fung Tao as the manager of the Red Dog Saloon, and got discharged and came home. So this was what I was calling a relatively good tour of duty in the U.S. Army. And I have friends that came back from Vietnam and were picking shrapnel out of their legs. Some that came back with severe injuries. I have a friend that I go fishing with that has severe damage to his legs from Agent Orange. Sores and bleeding and so forth. And I've been told that everybody was exposed to Agent Orange, and maybe that's why I've got COPD and some heart trouble, but I don't know that for a fact. That could have been for the fact that I smoked for 40 years, more than likely. So anyway, I'm cautious about who I talk to, about what I've done. I try to make sure I don't offend anybody. And after I get to know people, usually they understand. So. Interesting stories. When I got there, the Red Dog Saloon was 2 GP large tents with an outdoor theater. We had tiers where you could sit, and a stage, and a screen back there. The back of the stage was a wooden screen for a projection booth. So we had a movie every night. I had a little hooch behind there. Are you from this area? You ever heard of Fred Kirby? You ever? Yeah, I asked you about it. About it last night. Yeah. Anyway, these people at the 2nd Maintenance Battalion where I served, where I was in Vietnam, were from Oklahoma. It was formed from Oklahoma. So they're basically country western folks, So we were talking, and they asked about where I was from, and I told them I was from Charlotte, North Carolina. They said, "Oh, that's Fred Kirby's, where Fred Kirby's from." Fred Kirby's a country western musician, I guess. The dueling banjos, you've heard of that? That was Fred Kirby's. But anyway, I was real surprised that was what the connotation was for where I was from. But the Oklahoma guys were really kind of neat, because while we were there, they built a club, took down the GP large tents and actually built a structure with a framed structure with a roof and everything else. And these guys were handy. I mean, they came out there and they whipped out their saws and took the boards and laid the stuff across their knees to cut it. And I thought, okay, it's they were cool anyway. We had let me tell you about the Red Dog Saloon. This was interesting. It was a non-appropriated funds club. This was intended to be a cooler in the corner of a barracks. This one went beyond that a little bit, and we had it was the 2nd Maintenance Battalion, so they had reconditioned some coolers. In fact, they reconditioned them a couple of times while I was there. So we had coolers for the beer, and we had these buildings for the club, and we had ping pong tables and pool tables, and we had a projection booth and a projectionist, and I had 2 bartenders that worked for me and 2 MAs, that's Master at Arms. They were bouncers, but they weren't bouncers. I'll tell you about something about that interesting later. Or at least I thought it was interesting. And we would go through about 60 cases of beer a night, which is interesting because we had 120 people in the company. Of course, we had some strangers come in too, particularly since we had showed a movie every night. And if I got time, I'll tell you about that too. That was funny, although it was illegal. Maybe I shouldn't say that. But anyway, we sold a lot of beer and we made quite a bit of money. And the reason we made money, and Paige will probably could tell you about this, was, do you know they use script? You know what MPC is? Military Payment Certificates. It's paper money. We had paper nickels. They were little things about that big. Paper dimes, quarters, dollars. You know, it was just money for us. But it was not money because it didn't work on the black market like the greenbacks would have. But we didn't have any paper pennies. So the reason the club made so much money selling what we sold was that I bought beer for $2 from the Vongtower Regional Exchange for $2.45 a case. That's 24 cans. I couldn't sell it for 10 cents a can, right? So I had to sell it for 15 cents a can, which was 30% profit, which is wild, you know, when you start thinking about a business making 30% profit on their items. So we came up with money, so we wound up with things like we booked shows. That's partly what we had the stage for. We had a best show we had. You ever heard of the Safaris? Wipeout, the drum solo Wipeout, that's the Safaris. They came. They played on our stage for us. And the interesting part about that, we were supposed to get a Korean dance troupe. And they called and said, oh, they got stuck up in someplace else and weren't going to be able to make it. Would it be all right if a band called the Safaris came around and said, oh, hell yeah. I mean, oh, heck yeah. So they were real good. They came and they stayed in the barracks. The men stayed in the barracks, and the guy's sister, who was one of the vocalists, stayed at the hospital. Stayed with the nurses. It wasn't really a hospital, it was a clinic. So they stayed and played and way past closing time and stuff like that. It was just fascinating. It was a ball. There again, I've had a good time so often. I mentioned this was not appropriated funds club. It was supposed to be a cooler. So we had a maximum net worth of $2,500, which is hard to do since one time I bought like $17,000 worth of beer. So you have to do some... No, it's all good, but it's kind of tricky with the book work. But anyway, it works out. You can work it out, because what we did with the profits was we distributed it to the platoons within the company. And I had a warehouse, and I had secretariats, you know, and this platoon had this beer stacked over there. And if I needed beer, I could take it from them. Or if they needed it, they could come get it. They had beach parties. Vongtower, by the way, is on the South China Sea. It's got a front beach, back beach. It was a nice place. The beach was so much nicer and prettier than Waikiki that it was sad when I went to Hawaii almost, you know. But anyway, they could just pick up their supplies and come by with a trailer load of ice and pick up some beer and go and pick up some steaks and go and have a beach party if they wanted to. And it was approved by the commander. So, I forget where I'm going now. Anyway.
You're talking about the shows and all too. Some of the entertainers.
Yeah. So we'd book shows, pay them. I paid the bartenders. They paid me, which is surprising. I couldn't believe they did that because I didn't have any other duties. Now, my bartenders had other duties and were doing this on their own time. But anyway, they paid me for what I was doing, partly, I guess, because I was doing all the book work at night. And I had the maximum net worth of $2,500. That's what I was talking about. So I had a maximum amount of money that I could keep in my safe in my hooch. You know, that's also a regulation that we had to fit. So I made weekly trips to Tonsanut to go to the Bank of America up there. So
Tonsanut was right outside Saigon.
Yeah. Actually, it's almost the same place, isn't it?
Almost, yeah.
Maybe like Pawleys Island in Georgetown.
Yeah, something like
Yeah. The airport is in Tonsanut. But anyway, that was funny too. Totally offline. I'm going to vary here for a second. I thought it was so neat, not neat really, but interesting, that landing at Cameron Bay was not too bad, but take off and landing at Tonsanut when I was going to R&R in Hawaii was interesting, I thought, because of the way they land and they take off. You know, you usually come in and land, and you take off and climb, and coming in at Tonsanut, and you take off, and then they pour it on climbing like mad, you know. I guess because of the possibility of, well, I know because of the possibility of attack. But I found that interesting. I find interest in unusual things anyway sometimes. People call me weird. But anyway, I'd go to the Bank of America and at least once a week. Sometimes, depending on the income, I might have to run up there twice a week. Sometimes I'd spend overnight. And come back, and that was most of my work over there, other than the book work. Interestingly enough, I was a non-combatant essentially, but I got real interested at times. We were coming back from Tonsanut one time, coming to Vung Tau, and we'd been in the air way too long to get where I was going, so I didn't know where we were. I can't remember right now where we were landed, but we landed somewhere it looked like a red dirt road in the middle of the woods. You know, no, just a strip. And we landed, and this guy, the ramp at the back of the caribou went down, and this guy picked up his pack and his rifle and walked off the back and walked off into the jungle. I said, oh, no, I don't think so. I'd have to have somebody meet me. That was what I realized was a combatant. Other interesting thing was at Vung Tau, there were a number of bases. There was an Air Force base, a Navy base, Army base, a Korean Army base, and the White Horse Division was basically patrolling. Vung Tau was on a peninsula, Mekong Delta over here and the South China Sea over here, and basic protection at the entrance to this peninsula was the Korean White Horse Division. And it was, I don't know how to put this. When you went downtown to Vung Tau, you would have people tugging at you to get you to do something. Can I say, come see my sister? You know, this kind of thing, you know, or wanting to say you something, but the Korean soldiers walked down the street and they would get out of their way. I guess it's different. They looked at the other Asians differently. Now, they're different. I at one time could tell the difference between the Chinese and the Vietnamese and the Koreans, and they are, but it comes and goes. It fades with time, I guess. I couldn't tell you right now, except they are different. Just an interesting story, maybe. I thought it was interesting. When we were getting ready to go to Vietnam, we had what they call a Vietnam orientation, and I'm sure Paige did this too. But they were talking about snakes. And he said, now in basic training, you learn that there are 4 kinds of poisonous snakes in the States. You know, the copperhead, rattlesnake, coral snake, moccasin. He says, now you're going to Southeast Asia, and they got 2,000 varieties of snakes, and 210 of them are poisonous, and we're not going to try to teach you to identify these poisonous, venomous snakes. So if you see a snake, just leave it the hell alone. Assume it's venomous. And I thought, okay, now I can live with that. And that brings up another funny story. There was a problem at Vung Tau being on the South China Sea, on a coastal town, I guess. Something about the water level or something like that. The sewage stuff, they couldn't have sewage. We have a Quonset hut that had showers and toilets and everything else in it, and you could shower in there, but they had the toilets covered up because they wouldn't operate. So we had, they don't call them outhouses, what do you call them?
Yeah, latrines or.
Yeah, latrines. We had the latrines outside along the fence line out there. And they had a group of local nationals. Actually, they were boys that would come by, and they had a sergeant that worked with them that kept them policing the area, you know, keeping everything clean and cleaned up. And in these latrines, they had a half of a 55-gallon drum under the toilets, and they would pull those out, put in a clean one, and take those and use a little diesel fuel and burn it to ash and dispose of it, you know. And one time they were out there and they pulled out one of those barrels, and they had to get their hoe, and they pulled out a 8-foot cobra, which they killed. But it was real funny. And I did the same thing, you know, but it was funny to watch at night, you know, along the line, you know, where all the people would go to the latrine, leave the barracks and go wherever, and they'd go to the latrines, and they'd have these flashlights. They'd carry didn't used to carry these flashlights all the time, but they'd have these flashlights, and they'd go out there with these flashlights, and you just watch those flashlights go all over the place, you know, shining that stuff around. That was I guess I thought that was funny, although I took my flashlight too. You know, I'm not laughing at anybody. It was just humorous, and I participated in the humor. As you could probably, I imagine you'd have carried a flashlight too. That was a big snake. I don't know anything else to say. About got in trouble, and you may want to edit part of this, I don't know. They supplied movies, and the NCO club and some of the other clubs in the area had a movie, and they would show it, and they had maybe 3 movies, and they'd rotate them around, and they'd change the movies. And I usually showed a better movie than they showed, and I usually showed a different movie every night. And the reason was the postmaster at Vung Tau liked to come out. We weren't supposed to sell a beer unopened, you know, but we would sell him we'd sell him 4 or 5 beers in a bag with some ice, and he would sit out there and watch the movie and drink his beers, and he like I said, he was the postmaster, and they had movies at the post office. They were supposedly assigned to a ship. You know, they had this huge bag of movies that was going to the USS something or other, but it was just sitting there, and he let us borrow it. Probably not supposed to do that. It may be actually illegal, I don't know, but we did it, you know, it didn't hurt a soul. Nobody was hurt by it, because before it was ever delivered, it was put back. But we had that's partly why we sold so much beer on 60 to 80 cases out to, it wasn't to 120 people, you know, it was to whoever wanted to come and watch a movie and drink a beer and whatever. And we had a fairly decent, nice little club instead of a tent, you know. So that's how that worked out. So we showed a lot of nice movies and had a good time. I don't know if you'd be interested in the Cowboys or not. Like I said, we showed a movie a night, and the mess hall was here and the club was here, and the night cook did all the bread making and cakes and stuff like that. Couldn't watch the movie because he was busy. And after the club closes, when I did all my book work. So he would come over after he was through, and we were basically closed, and he would bring a little pizza or something, you know, and he and I would have a beer and a little pizza, and he would watch the movie on the wall of the projection booth. But, and I have absolutely nothing against him, and I always liked Roger Staubach, but every other word out of his, you know, alternate word out of his mouth was dazzling Dallas Cowboys, and I began to hate them. It was just too much. Now, that wasn't interesting to anybody, I don't guess, but I spent 2 years in because I was drafted. Came home from that. They notified me one day that I needed to catch a flight that Sunday. I had less than a week to get ready to come home. And I came home in one day, discharged that day, left the base in California a little before midnight and caught a flight to Charlotte. And after that, I went to work. Went to work for Duke Power in Charlotte, North Carolina. When I retired, well, after my wife retired, she and I both retired at 55. She tried to get me to move down here without her, and I said, oh, no. I think she was trying to get rid of me. I don't know of anything. Interestingly enough, I don't know if this is interesting or not. In Fort Eustis, our commander was Captain Lacey R. Smith. I always thought Captain Lacey was interesting, but he was very gung-ho military. He tried to get me to go to OCS. I'd said no, I'd applied when I was in basic training, and they didn't like my attitude, I guess, because I'd said I'd rather spend, I thought, I'd probably rather spend 4 years in the Army as an officer instead of 2 years as a corporal or whatever, you know. And that's not what they want in OCS. They want somebody that's going to stay and be an officer for a military officer. But he tried to get me to go to OCS, and then he tried to get me to go to warrant officer school. And I turned that down too, because that would have been another 4 years in addition to the one I already had as a draftee. But then he left, and then later on, I was over there. Student Officers Company that I was in Virginia was basically sort of like basic training, except it was for the second lieutenants that were coming out of college. So they would come there for their, what would have been 8 weeks of basic training like we'd done through at Fort Bragg. And I was the company armorer and took care of the M60s and the 45s and the 14s. We had M14s. Interestingly enough, I did not know, only place I ever saw M14s with selector switches was at the Student Officer Company. But anyway, I was over there and I was cleaning the M60s from being on the infiltration course the night before. and I was working on the M60s, and First Sergeant came running over, said, "You got to come with me. You got to come with me." And I said, "What for?" He says, "I got a call from the NCO Leadership School up here," and he said, "If you're not there by 1 o'clock, you're going to be AWOL." Apparently, Captain Lacey Smith didn't need my permission to enroll me in the NCO Leadership School. So we went up there, and I fell into formation with the rest of the people that were there for the leadership school. They were in their pressed, clean uniforms, and I was in my oily fatigues. Good first impression, good first impression. But I was married. That was my first wife, by the way. Lived off base, and the concept was, I didn't particularly care for it, but I had to, if you stayed in the top 10% of your class, you did not have to make the 4 o'clock formation and go to the chow with the rest of the group. So I worked real hard to stay in the top 10% of my class. So at 4 o'clock formation, when everybody else formed up to go get chow, I went to my car, which was down the street, which I wasn't supposed to have, and went home for the evening, came back for whatever they call it when you have to be supposed to be in bed. So I did that. And as a result, I graduated as the top graduate. I was the number 1 graduate, got a little plaque, and I got a little letter of commendation from Major General Redling. And I think that had a lot, that plus being 26, had a lot to do with the fact that when I got to Vung Tau, the commander wanted me to take over managing the club. Was 26-year-old with what, good credentials, I guess you'd have to call that, instead of a 17-year-old, 18-year-old, whatever, you know. But I thought that was interesting too, how that works, how things work out sometimes, you know, just fortuitous, I guess.
Yep.
Okay. Now, I don't know anything else. You know, the commander there in Vung Tau was real interesting because he made me feel pretty good. He said, you have to realize how important this is for morale. Mm-hmm. So he said I was doing a good job, so that made me feel a little better. Mm-hmm. I've think about it every now and then, and every now and then you have a little, I guess in an extreme way you'd call it survivor guilt. Yeah. But then you can just sort of dispel that by saying, okay, it not my fault, yeah. Really. But it's an interesting experience. I tell people often, you know, it's a strange thing to say that it's not quite true, but it is sort of true, in that I enjoyed my tour in Vietnam.
I did too.
It was, maybe enjoy is not, I was anxious to get home. Right. Very glad to get back home and to get out. But it was interesting. There was a lot of fascinating stuff going on. It's hard to explain to some people. You're shaking your head. I know you know what I'm talking about. Yeah. I'm glad it happened. Glad I did it.